Go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Gregory Phillips with 𝐓𝐡𝐞 Communications. Welcome to the latest 𝐓𝐡𝐞 media briefing on the COVID-19 pandemic. We are recording this briefing and that recording will be available to everyone who registered. With promising trials for several COVID vaccines in hand, manufacturers and governments are gearing up to vaccinate billions of people over the next year and beyond. We have 4 experts with us today in vaccination, global health, law and economics to discuss the challenges and inequities involved in manufacturing and distributing a COVID vaccine globally during an ongoing epidemic. With us today is Dr. Thomas Denny. He is Chief Operating Officer of the Duke Human Vaccine Institute, a Professor of Medicine and an affiliate member of the Duke Global Health Institute. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
And we have David McAdams, a professor at Duke's Fuqua School of Business, who has proposed a mechanism using game theory to help ensure equitable distribution of COVID vaccines. Good morning to you.
Hello.
Also with us is Arti. She is a professor at the Duke Law School, where she is also faculty director of the Center for Innovation Policy. Her recent work includes a paper on the need for information sharing among vaccine manufacturers. Good morning.
Good morning.
And we have Dr. Gavin Yamey. He is a professor of the practice at Duke Global Health Institute. He's also director of the Center for Policy Impact in Global Health, which addresses challenges in healthcare financing and delivery. And he worked with David McAdams on the game theory vaccine distribution mechanism. Good morning, Dr. Yamey.
Hello.
Okay, Dr. Denny, we'll start with you. Now that we have promising vaccine results and the expectation of an emergency use authorization here in the US, it feels like attention is shifting to mass manufacture and distribution. Is that premature? What should we be focused on as the FDA considers the results we've had so far?
Well, I think there's a couple things to focus on. And obviously the first part is, we need to be excited and pleased with where the science has got us in a very short period of time. If you look to previous campaigns with other infectious diseases in terms of years to get a vaccine. So we've made a remarkable achievement. I think manufacturing the scale up is a challenge when you're thinking about the number of doses that need to be produced. Whenever you do something of this size, there's probably going to be some setbacks along the way, batches that don't meet quality control and will not be able to be released. So there will be some challenges as we scale up. And then distribution. There will be some challenges with distribution, but we need to look at our experiences. And we've had a lot of experience in other areas with getting distribution. And for one, if you look at the PEPFAR program for HIV, that's a program that has been around now about 15 years, maybe a little bit more. And we've used that program to get antiretroviral therapies throughout resource challenge communities. It's had a good experience, I think, in scaling up. It could have been faster, but it's worked. So I think we can look to a lot of previous experiences to not necessarily reinvent the wheel, but just to learn from that and improve upon that to meet the current needs. And then the last thing I think that we need to be focusing on is we still need work to do. We still have work to do. We need to be thinking about the long-term efficacy of these vaccines. We know that the data is suggesting that they're good efficacy signals in the short term. But how does that hold up 6 months, 9 months, 12 months? And is this going to be something that we're going to have to keep doing as we go forward till we get maybe another vaccine development that gives us longer lasting coverage? So I think we still have a lot of challenges, but I think it's time to be happy that we are starting to see some light in this tunnel and hopefully some bright spots going forward into 2021.
Sure, absolutely. I think if we need anything in 2020, it is bright spots. Thank you for that. Professor Rai, I'd like to move on to you. One of the concerns that's already been aired, at least across the US, is this concern about pharmaceutical companies being granted exemption from liability for any injuries that might result from COVID vaccine, especially as Dr. Denny mentioned, we don't know what the long-term effects might be. Can you explain exactly what exemption from liability means and whether it's common or particularly unusual for a vaccine?
So it's not unusual for the context in which we're speaking right now, which is not the ordinary kind of preventive childhood vaccination context, although there is a compensation there and some relative exception for liability. But to focus on this particular exemption, this is for the situation that we're dealing with now, which is seen as part of emergency preparedness generally. So there was a statute passed in 2005 called the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, known in the lingo as the PrEP Act. And the reason for that was after the concerns about bioterror back around the time of September 11th, there was a lot of concern that developing emergency vaccines at either pandemic speed or terrorist speed would challenge companies because they would be concerned about liability if a vaccine had to be developed very, very quickly, as we've seen in this case. As Dr. Denny has pointed out, it's been remarkable the speed at which things are developed, and that's wonderful. But it's also, we do have to be concerned about side effects, and companies are concerned about liability. So as a consequence, the HHS secretary has the ability under the PrEP Act to declare an emergency, and those declarations occurred with respect to the H1N1 pandemic flu, the Ebola virus, and the Zika virus. So this has happened before, and it's a very specific set of circumstances in which the HHS secretary can declare an emergency. And he did do so on March 17th, 2020. And the scope of liability protection is extremely broad. It covers any vaccine, but also any antiviral, drug, biologic, diagnostic device, as well as any device used in the administration of any such product and components, constituent materials. One can read off the language because it goes on at great length. It's drafted obviously very carefully by lawyers. The only exception is willful misconduct. And so consequently, this is something that the United States has done, I think, very well. Now, other countries we can talk about, but the United States has set up a situation where I don't think there's any meaningful reason for manufacturers to be concerned about liability.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you very much. We'll come back to that topic, but I'm glad you mentioned other countries because moving on from that, Gavin, Yamey, we know that in order to successfully fight this virus or even eradicate it, there has to be a global approach. We have to vaccinate globally. Now, unfortunately, we know that from history, we can't just assume that vaccination will take place on a global scale. Why is that, and what are the barriers?
Well, so that's right. I mean, the first thing to say is there's an adage in global health, in public health, and it's become a bit of a cliche, but it's absolutely true, which is that an outbreak anywhere can become an outbreak everywhere. So we're really not going to bring this pandemic under control until we've controlled viral transmission everywhere. Can't just be in the rich world. If we look at previous pandemics, we were already concerned based on previous pandemics that the vaccine may not be distributed fairly globally. If we go back to 2009, Arti mentioned H1N1. During the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, we did develop a vaccine, and rich nations entered into these deals, bilateral purchase agreements, they're called, direct deals with vaccine manufacturers to buy supply of that vaccine. So the rich countries got more of it quicker, and poorer countries were left behind. They got fewer doses, slower. So we were already worried that this might happen again. And I'm very sad to say that behavior has repeated itself. Rich nations are hoarding the vaccine. We all know now about the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine. Over 80% of all doses of those two vaccines have already been purchased by rich nations, poor nations left behind. So that is an enormous concern. There is, of course, a new facility, which we're going to talk about today, the COVAX facility. That is really the main game in town for trying to achieve the kind of distribution that Dr. Denny talked about, a global distribution. It's run by the World Health Organization, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and CEPI in Norway, which makes the vaccines. And there is a big hope that they will be able to buy enough vaccine to distribute it to low and middle income countries. And what we did, and I'm going to pass you over to David now, Professor McAdams, what we did was to say, actually, the bilateral deals that are happening right now, is there a way that they could be configured? Is there a way that they could be set up? Are there certain principles that could guide those bilateral deals that could be win-win globally? Could they be established in a way that benefited low and middle income countries as well? And I think I'll stop there and pass over to Professor McAdams.
Sure. So, Professor McAdams, we know that COVAX is set up as an international body, you know, that countries can buy into for distributing vaccines. So what is it that you guys have come up with that would incentivize rich countries as well as the struggling more countries that could, so we'll all be into this together? How can it work?
Let me just back up for a second and acknowledge that kind of this race to develop vaccines around the world has the potential to take on the flavor of what we call a zero-sum game, where something we do to benefit ourselves here in the United States might harm others by delaying their access to the vaccine. But it doesn't have to be that way. And that's the focus of our analysis, is trying to find ways for win-win. So the things that rich countries do to benefit themselves could actually also benefit poor parts of the world. And there's several ways that can happen, but the most important is through transferring know-how and capabilities. So we've already seen this in the relationship for the Oxford vaccine with the Serum Institute in India. Okay, so that's a planned relationship where, as AstraZeneca is scrambling to produce doses that, as Gavin mentioned, are going by and large to the rich countries like Europe and so on, the Serum Institute also is standing up facilities to produce a planned 1 billion doses that will go to people in India and other lower income countries. The real question is that we're calling for more attention to in our work is what's going to happen to the facilities currently producing vaccines that aren't yet approved that fail. Okay, we've been very lucky so far that the vaccines have been succeeding, but there are facilities all around the world that right now are churning out doses of vaccines that are not going to be distributed because they're not going to be safe or effective. What happens to those facilities? Will we be able to repurpose those to produce a successful vaccine? How quickly can we do that? Okay, so we're calling on attention to this matter because if we can lay the groundwork for that sort of tech transfer, the sort of knowledge capability transfer, we can stand up those other facilities faster and get more doses out into the world quicker, and that will benefit poor people everywhere.
Fantastic, thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists for those opening questions. We've certainly got a lot to dig into here. At this point, I'm going to open it up to questions. Thanks to those reporters who already sent questions. I'm going to tackle some of those in a moment. But if you have questions that you'd like to ask, you can type them into the Q&A window here on Zoom, which is in the bottom right of your Zoom window, or you can raise your hand in Zoom. If you are calling in by phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9, and then we can unmute you so that you can ask your question. Now, we've got, as I said, a number of questions that are coming in advance, so I'm going to start with those. And wherever I happen to direct these panelists, if any of you want to weigh in once somebody's answered a question, then please do so. One of the questions, Dr. Denny, I'll start with you. There are a lot of questions about children. We know that the currently vaccines that seem to be on the cusp of approval have all been tested in adults, and that children are a very different thing. We hear lots of things about how the virus isn't either as prevalent in children or not serious. What should we expect, or what is the current situation as regards vaccine trials for children, and what would you expect to see from that over the next few months and year?
So the current trials have been mostly done in adults or older children, as best I'm aware. There are protocols being developed right now that will open very soon into the new year. Duke will be one site where we will begin to look at clinical trials in younger children. And this is not unusual. Most clinical trials with new products start out usually in healthy adults of different ages, and then as we go through that process and learn that they're safe, then we move into other age groups. So I think it will be key to get clinical trials performed in children and learn that the vaccines are safe and effective. One day this may be something that is just part of, well baby immunization schedules, that at a certain age, you would receive this vaccine just like a group of other vaccines. But we first have to have the trials to show that it is safe for that age group.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Professor Rye, question for you. Obviously, it's understandable that the companies that are involved in developing these vaccines, want to be compensated for their work, and they have patents on the vaccines that they're developing. But do you see that there is a balance being struck, because I'm guessing companies don't wish to be seen as profiteering, in the midst of a pandemic, while at the same time they're obviously getting massive orders from countries for these vaccines that will allow them presumably to make a good deal of revenue from that. So do you see that, because I know early on in the vaccine development process, there were hopes that there would be unprecedented cooperation and freedom of information sharing between vaccine manufacturers. And I know you've written about this. So has that unfolded the way you would expect? Do you think that companies are going to take an unprecedented kind of approach to actually curing this pandemic, or is it more business as usual?
So I think those are both great questions. There's two slightly separate questions, and I will take each of them on as you ask them. So one is the issue of price, and within that, of course, there's rich countries versus poor countries, or an infinite gradations between. So I think overall the pricing issue is not going to be an issue, at least in the rich world. I think that in general, it appears that the rich world will be able to pay what's necessary so that individual people in the rich world don't have to pay exorbitant prices, or any prices at all, really, perhaps, because this is basically what the US government and other rich governments have done by hoarding these vaccines. They've just put in so many orders that there's prices not going to be an issue, despite the patents and all the rest of it. The question now, of course, price may be an issue for the developing world or lower LMI countries, and we can talk about that. That's a very important issue, and whether there's going to be what's known by economists as price discrimination for those countries, or the COVAX facility will be able to supply enough at a sufficiently low price, is a very interesting question, an important question. As for the issue of knowledge sharing, well, Professor McAdams really and Dr. Yamey really got at the heart of the question by getting to, will we see knowledge sharing of the sort that AstraZeneca has done with the Serum Institute by the Modernas and Pfizers of the world, which are using a different platform. They're using a platform called the mRNA platform, which is more tricky in some respects, although easier in other respects. And we can talk about that if folks are interested. But so let's say that a facility that failed along the lines of what Professor McAdams was talking about, or the vaccine that it was producing failed, then could be stood up to manufacture mRNA. Would Pfizer and Moderna be willing to transfer some very sophisticated technical knowledge that's necessary to stand up that facility and move it, say, from a protein subunit platform to an mRNA platform? And that would require some significant technical transfer. AstraZeneca has been very good. I haven't seen Pfizer and Moderna necessarily stepping up, but part of the issue with all of this is also we don't know what the contracts call for in terms of repurposing. So the US government has said that it's willing to repurpose facilities and so forth and so on, but whether these contracts say that the companies in question have to transfer the technical knowledge, at least I'm not aware of sufficient transparency to know. And transparency with respect to the contracts is a huge issue as well.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Dr. Yamey, I'd like to move on to you and touch on one of the elements of this knowledge transfer that's important. One of the things we know is that in the US and in other countries, there are going to be these challenges, logistical challenges of getting vaccines, especially the Pfizer vaccine that has to be kept so cold, into rural and remote areas if we're going to achieve this kind of global vaccination that we need. Can you talk a little bit about some of those challenges of reaching the most remote communities in the US and abroad, and what kind of understanding that you have right now is the approaches that are going to be taken to do that when it's so impractical?
Sure. So a couple of things. Firstly, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, has been supporting low and middle income countries for over a decade now in distributing vaccines. Gavi sits in Geneva. It doesn't have country officers. It funds countries to deliver vaccines themselves. So these are national programs, and Gavi has been helping to overcome bottlenecks for many years now and to set up supply chains. Of course, the second thing to say is, depending upon the vaccine, there are going to be so-called cold chain challenges, You know, one of the vaccines, as you know, has to be kept as cold as the South Pole, the Pfizer vaccine, and that presents challenges. The third thing I would say is that there have been successful vaccines distributed in pandemics in low-income settings, Ebola in the DRC, for example, showing that it can be done. One of the biggest challenges, I think, and we haven't really talked much about it yet for this pandemic, is that the people who are going to be vaccinated first, presumably, are going to be older people particularly with medical conditions who are medically vulnerable, and health workers. And the programs that I just mentioned that Gavi has been funding year on year, those have mostly been childhood vaccinations. So that presents somewhat of a challenge. We don't have a huge amount of global experience in low and middle income countries reaching adults with vaccines. To some extent with pregnant women, yes, but less so with older adults, perhaps with the exception of flu vaccine campaigns in some countries. So I do think that is going to be a challenge. And then just the last point I would make, back to Dr. Denny's discussion about the child safety of the vaccine in children. My pediatrician colleagues have tried to convince me, and I think I am convinced now, that we are going to be asleep at the wheel on this issue if we don't think about children. We have excellent vaccination programs and delivery channels for reaching children ready to go now. And actually, one way to reach herd immunity more quickly would be to vaccinate children, because it could take a long time to set up these, you know, delivery channels for older people. They don't really exist right now. And I hadn't really got my head around that. So I think there is some urgency about knowing the safety and efficacy in children for that reason.
Gotcha, thank you. And I think we'll certainly come back to this this issue of children. For right now, we have a raised hand as well as some questions in the Q&A that I'll get to in a moment. But if we can go ahead and unmute Emily, I think you're unmuted, so you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hey, this is Emily Kopp with CQ Roll Call. I wanted to ask, there was a prediction yesterday. An expert said that he thinks that we can vaccinate the global population in 2 years because these mRNA vaccines are so easy to scale up. And I'm wondering if you could weigh in on whether you think that's a reasonable expectation. And I'm also wondering if you think the change in administration will affect the US's approach to participating in global technology sharing, and will change the US's approach to transparency with regards to the contracts with pharmaceutical companies. Thanks.
Who wants to take that one?
I was just about to say the same thing.
I mean, I'm happy to.
I'll kind of comment on the manufacturing of the RNAs. That is it's an easier platform for scaling up. It does provide some challenges for distribution and the cold chain, as we've talked about, but it's certainly easier to get large batch numbers of vaccine via the RNA method than some of the traditional ways we have, a flu vaccine, for example, each year, what we call protein-based vaccines or other types of vaccines. The manufacturing process there is a bit more challenging when you need large dosing. So the RNA platform does give us hope that we can make the quantities that we need that we need for the distribution. And I guess I'll turf to Gavin or others on the political aspects of going forward and how we play in the world.
Thanks. So a couple of things on the global side. First of all, if all goes according to plan, if everything lines up perfectly, COVAX hopes to have enough doses to vaccinate 1 billion people by the end of next year. So that's it's going to require probably a 2-dose regimen. So that's 2 billion doses by the end of the next year. That would vaccinate only 20% of the population in each low income and lower middle income countries. Those are the two income groups that COVAX will be supplying vaccine to, funded by donors. So that's only 20% of the population. I'm looking today at the latest numbers, just so I don't, mess it up. Right now, COVAX has only secured 0.7 billion doses. So it's nowhere near what they're hoping for, compared to 3.8 billion by high income countries. So I do think there are going to be some equity challenges, and the success or failure of global vaccine herd immunity is going to require COVAX, to be able to procure more doses than at the current rate of procurement. Then on the change of administration, yesterday, I'm sorry to plug myself here, but I'm a columnist for Time magazine, and Nahid Badilia at Boston University, who directs the Special Pathogens Unit, we have a piece out that is aimed at the Biden transition team. We sent it to the team, that it sort of lays out some of the things that we think the transition team could be doing now during the lame duck period. I do think, partisan politics aside, I do think we're going to see a sea change, not just in terms of the competence. We've had the most incompetent federal response probably of any high-income country that I can think of. We obviously have, a fifth or so of the world's deaths and cases. We haven't had an evidence-based, science-based response. It's really been distressing. I do think you're going to see a sea change in basic competence, but also I do think we will be returning to the international global health system. We will return to the World Health Organization. My prediction is that the USA will join COVAX. It has not to date. They have sat it out, and I suspect they will. So I do think that the US will be returning to the international system in that way.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. Emily, I hope that answered your question.
So can I just jump in on the transparency piece of the question, which I think,
Please do.
If you don't mind. So the transparency piece of the question, I agree with everything Dr. Yamey has said regarding the change in administration yielding a sea change in many aspects. Whether it'll yield a sea change in transparency, I'm not as sure. The intellectual property questions tend to be a little less divided along partisan lines, and it is the case that the intellectual property issues are often as much Democratic issues as they are Republican issues. So that'll be an interesting set of questions, because there's a little bit of a double intellectual property question, because it's the intellectual property that is discussed in the contracts itself, and then there's the secrecy around the contracts, because the contracts themselves are sometimes considered, or often considered, to have trade secret aspects, and that is a less partisan issue than, and here I'm revealing my partisan priors, than some of the basic faith and science stuff that I think one party is probably more on the side of science than the other right now.
Sure. Thank you, all of you, for those answers. We've got some questions here in the Q&A that we're going to go ahead and tackle. Dr. Denny, if you want to tackle this one, it said, do we know if any of the vaccine candidates actually prevent infection? And if not, could vaccinated individuals also potentially transmit the virus?
So I think we'll learn more of this when we see the data that's presented at the FDA in another week or so. So what I think we do know is that each of the vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna, have shown to have 95% efficacy in what I have read is preventing infection or reducing severe disease. So, it's not uncommon that a vaccine does not totally prevent from being infected, but if you do get infected, the vaccine immunity that's been generated kicks in on overdrive at that point and helps to contain and minimize the consequences of the infection. So I think we'll learn more of that as we see data come out in the FDA review.
Gotcha. Thank you. Another question in the Q&A, which maybe yourself or Dr. Yamey could tackle. So it says that given the racial income disparities we've seen in terms of COVID risk and deaths here in the US, is there concern that we'll see the same kind of unequal access in low-income communities as regards to the vaccines? And what steps, if any, could the federal government take to ensure equitable distribution, at least here in the US?
I'm happy to go ahead.
I'll defer to you, Gavin. I'll defer to you.
No, I mean, look, absolutely the same inequities that we've been talking about globally that could happen here, you know, on these shores, if we're not careful. The data are very clear right now that Black Americans, Latinx Americans, Native Americans, the death rate from COVID-19 is higher than in the general population. That is related to deep-seated structural racism, the legacy of slavery, of Jim Crow, of redlining. That is related to who is taking jobs that put them at higher risk, you know, from care homes to meatpacking warehouses. You know, this is deep-seated. These inequities were present before COVID-19. They've been more starkly exposed. So I think that every panel that has looked at how vaccine should be prioritized. I was very, very impressed, for example, by the Institute of Medicine. It's not called that anymore. They changed their name years ago. I just can't get it out of the National Academy of Medicine. That panel recommended that people of color should be early in the prioritization. I was also incredibly happy to see that they also recommended people who are in jails, prisons, ICE detention centers, juvenile detention centers, those who are homeless. You know, the people who are at higher risk should be vaccinated early. So there's a lot of thinking now, a lot of scholarship, particularly amongst scholars of color themselves, in how we might do that. We have to, of course, also recognize at the same time that there are communities that may be suspicious of the notion of early vaccination, again, because of the legacy of medical experimentation, perhaps most famously the Tuskegee experiment, where Black Americans were left with syphilis without treatment to watch what would happen. That went from 1932 to 1972. That is recent. This remaining suspicion absolutely warranted. And I think we need to tease out, when people talk about vaccine hesitancy, I think we have to figure out what's going on. Is it, you know, in some communities, that suspicion is completely understandable. So I think working with communities is key. This afternoon, Lavanya Vasudevan from Duke Global Health Institute and I will be on a panel at the Triangle Global Health Consortium. She is an expert on vaccine hesitancy and on teasing out, you know, what does it really mean and how you overcome it. Working with communities is absolutely key. And I think what some of her research, and I'll stop here on this one, which I find really interesting, is that one of the most powerful predictors of whether a community will take up a vaccine is whether the health providers in that community take it themselves and go out there and say, here, look, watch, it's going in my arm today. I believe in it. Trust, you know, look, this is how much I believe in it. And I think that since this process, you know, where there was concern that the emergency use authorization would happen very quickly before the election for electoral reasons, that's off the table now. I think the medical community is breathing a sigh of relief that we can, I think, now go out and say this, you know, we believe Fauci on this, nothing was rushed here for electoral reasons. We believe in it, we trust it. So I think that is going to be an important step going forward.
Yeah, I would build on what Gavin said. I absolutely agree, and I take it a step to. I believe we need what I'm calling vaccine ambassadors for every community setting. And I was pleased to read this morning in the paper where former presidents Bush, Obama, and Clinton have agreed to be filmed taking the vaccine early on. But I think that's a wonderful start, but it has to go down to every level into local communities where community leaders, church leaders, other people that have status within a community say this is safe, this is good, we must do it, and participate. I think if you see that, then you will start to see people being more willing to take the vaccine early on.
Thank you
and
both
one
for
last
that.
thing I would Horrified to see the notion that prison guards might get it, but not people in jail themselves, incarcerated people. That is horrific.
Absolutely. Thank you both for that. And thank you, Gavin, for highlighting the work of Lavanya Vasudevan. We've had her on a previous briefing, hoping to have her back later this month or next month on this vaccine hesitancy question. Professor McAdams, I'd like to come back to you. The mechanism that you guys proposed for international equitable distribution of the vaccine is based in game theory, which is your area of expertise. You've applied that to countless real-world situations, from sharing water resources in the Midwest to saving the white rhino. I'm curious to put you on the spot here, because we have this vaccine hesitancy issue, and as Dr. Yamey pointed out, it's so multi-layered. But we need to incentivize people. We need to encourage people, convince them that a vaccine is safe, and get them to take it. Do you see any way that the game theory could be applied in that situation as a way of either helping understand a vaccine is safe or emphasizing how important it is to protect themselves and their communities?
I've thought about this. I don't think there's a magic bullet sort of game theory solution to pull out of the bag. I think the perspective that Dr. Denny and the others were mentioning is right, is that this is a relationship issue. So a lot of people just aren't equipped to judge for themselves the safety of the vaccine. So they look to social cues. And unfortunately, a lot of the discussion we've been having around vaccines has been politicized. And so this puts us in the hole. And to dig out of it, I think a good approach is to, as Dr. Denny said, to approach people that others trust and start spreading awareness and comfort that way. So no, unfortunately, I don't think there's a magic bullet here, but just a lot of work at the community and personal level.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. We've got more questions in the Q&A. Going to get through as many of them as we can. We also have a raised hand, so we can go ahead and unmute you, Ilana Gordon, and please go ahead and ask your question. Okay. Not hearing anything there, but I see that same question has been posed in, well, it was posed in the Q&A, but it seems to have disappeared. Ilana, if you're not there, I'm going to move on and maybe come back to you if you are still there and would like to ask a question. So we have another here, which I think Dr. Denny might be good for you to tackle. If approximately 50% of the US was vaccinated by the end of next year, do we have any sense of what that would do for infection rates? Would we expect them to have fallen proportional to the amount of people who have gotten the vaccine? And I guess at what level of inoculation could we reach a point where masks and social distancing would no longer be required? I realize this is a crystal ball type question, but anything that any of you can contribute, we'd love to hear.
So both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, if it holds up, what we're hearing is they are 95% effective, at least in the short term. That is on an equivalence of what a lot of us refer to as a gold standard vaccine is measles. Measles protection from a measles vaccine is incredibly well. So that's great promise there, I think, in what the numbers are looking at. As I recall some modeling, and maybe Gavin is up on this more, but I recall some modeling earlier in the year that said that if we had a vaccine that was at least 70% effective, and we vaccinated 3/4 of the population, that would be enough to eradicate the disease. So if you extrapolate that to what the question is here, we have two vaccines with 95% efficacy. If we get 50% of the population covered, I think that puts us on a great trajectory of starting to eliminate this. I see 2021 as a transition year, that as we begin to get more people vaccinated, and I think it'll take us at least into the second quarter or end of second quarter to start seeing large numbers there, that slowly we begin to come out of the social distancing, public health behavior of maybe less masking or less social distance. But I do see that the majority of 21, I think we're still behaving like we're behaving right now. So we make sure we get people vaccinated and then truly start to understand the long-term efficacy. And what we have to remember is that the vaccines right now that are being considered for EUA approval are being approved based on clinical endpoints, or that is who got infected or who did not get, into comparing the placebo and the treatment group. There is a massive amount of work right now underway in the Operation Warp Speed labs that are beginning to test the samples from these individuals to see what type of antibody levels they have, and specifically what type of what we call a neutralizing antibody is present. And that then will help to give us a better understanding of how robust of a response is generated from these vaccines and for long term.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. Dr. Yamey, I'd like to move on for you. We have another question. Says there are more vaccines beyond just the Oxford, Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, but how does approval work in other countries? And how does that work with COVAX as regards, like, do countries rely on COVAX for approval, or is that purely, you know, for a distribution mechanism?
No, so that's a great question. It's actually a very simple one to answer. The only vaccines that will be distributed through COVAX, similar to the only vaccines that are ever distributed by Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, they have to go through what's called pre-qualification at the World Health Organization. So they need to be WHO pre-qualified for COVAX to include them. And so some of the vaccines that you may hear, that you may already have heard about, we're not really sure what's going on with the Sputnik vaccine. There may be vaccines in China that if those don't get WHO pre-qualification, they will not be included in the COVAX distribution.
Gotcha. Okay.
I wanted to just, if you don't mind, just go back to Tom Denny's brilliant point about the year. I think it's a year. I think he's right. I think it's a year of us masks and distancing, probably. I do just want to point out that there are many countries in the world right now that have essentially ended community transmission. And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact. Well, obviously, I'm as thrilled. I will go to my grave believing I'm a passionate believer in science and technology. And science is our way out of this. But I would have loved to be starting at a point where Taiwan is, or New Zealand, or Australia, or Vietnam, or Mongolia, or South Korea, or China, with almost no cases. You know, we may have 400 deaths by the end of January. You know, we're sort of hovering at 200,000 new cases a day. Yesterday, we had the largest number of deaths in a day in the whole of the pandemic. That is not a good place to be starting a vaccine campaign. So we shouldn't forget, I wish I was those countries that ended transmission without a vaccine. What a wonderful place they are in. And I'm not super optimistic that the current government has got its act together on distribution. They really bungled, well, they went beyond fumbling the ball on testing, on tracing, on protecting health workers from PPE. So I don't have a huge amount of confidence in distribution currently. So I do think we've got at least a year ahead of these so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions, distancing, masking, avoiding crowds, and so on.
Gotcha, thank you. And Dr. Yamey, I'll stay with you for another question we have in the Q&A. You know, we've talked about the inequities and the difficulties involved in getting vaccines to remote places. Given that we know with the ongoing pre-existent structural issues there are in low-income communities receiving a vaccine, would you expect that there will be a delay there in this real world that we're in, and knowing that these inequities exist? Are those likely, even though we have, you know, levels of priority, you would expect first responders and frontline workers and the elderly to be receiving vaccines? Should we expect that in rural areas, even those most at risk are going to be way delayed in getting their vaccines?
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Denny probably knows more about this than I do. Certainly, there has been reporting on the lack of these super refrigerators in rural areas. So with the one vaccine that needs super refrigeration, that could be a delay. One thing that I would say is that, and I'm sorry, I am sounding very partisan here, but if you do look at the transition team, the COVID-19 folks on that team, several of them have spent their life studying inequities. And I think that this is really, this question of distribution of the vaccine is intimately tied up with health inequities and racial injustice. And so I am hopeful that there will be awareness in the incoming administration of the need to, you know, go the final mile, reach those who have not traditionally been reached before. So I'm cautiously optimistic on that front. But yes, there will be greater challenges in rural districts. Dr. Denny, anything to add on that?
Sorry, I was muted. I'd agree with Gavin. We've learned from the HIV pandemic that, resource challenge areas have difficulties with refrigeration and storing of samples, or running laboratories, and where refrigeration and electrical, consistent electricity is important. And this is just going to parallel that same experience. So we're going to have to be prepared to supplement those areas, provide portable types of cooling devices to get vaccines distributed. If all the vaccines are going to be dependent on a cold chain, ideally we'd love to have a vaccine that was developed that did not have cold chain issues, but I think we have to work with what we have and begin to plan to have distribution that includes adequate cold chain provisions.
Gotcha. Thank you both. And Dr. Denny, we've had a version of this question come in a few times, and you tackled it somewhat in your opening comments, but I'd like you to expand on it if you can. You talked about efficacy. We've got a lot of questions about how long the vaccine will last, or how long the protection from the vaccine will last. Obviously, I guess the only thing that will tell us that definitively is time, but what do we know at this point about the however long-lasting the protection could be from any of these promising vaccine candidates?
Well, I think we know what we know from the data that we're hearing, and that is that short term is part of the clinical trials process. We know that the groups that received the vaccine had there was a 95% efficacy in either reducing severity of disease or in individuals becoming infected. Unfortunately, that's short term. You're talking about 3 months there, 4 months of study. There will be studies that will continue, that will be what we call the long haulers type of approach, where you will continue to follow up people and look for long-term protection. But until we actually get more markers, what we call of protection, antibody levels and functional antibody levels, and understand that, we're not going to know if you're going to need to take this, be boosted once a year, or be boosted, every 5 years. I mean, this could be something in the end. It ends up being a cocktail or a piggyback with an annual flu vaccine, or we could have future developments with vaccines that end up being better than what we're having right now for more durable or robust immunity over time. So I would just say this is all a work in progress, and we need to stay with this yet. To get more data to truly understand, how good these vaccines are going to be for long term.
Sure, thank you. Professor Rye, I'd like to come back to you. We know that we will need billions of doses of vaccine to approach covering the globe. But the manufacturing process, obviously the intellectual property that companies have is a huge part of that. So how does the intellectual property over manufacturing processes fit into the process here in terms of the massive scale of vaccine manufacturing that needs to take place?
So this goes to a larger question of developing capacity in low and middle income countries more generally for large molecule situations. So vaccines and so-called biologics are large molecules that are generally harder to manufacture, notwithstanding issues about mRNA, which we can get into. I think there's some dispute about whether mRNA is quite as easy as some people have made it out to be, although I'm not a scientist, so I will defer to those who say that, the scientists who say that the lipid formulation issue is not going to be a big issue, for example. So, but the overall question is, especially for future pandemics and also for this pandemic, perhaps, depending upon how much indigenous manufacturing capacity is needed in low and middle income countries, we really do have to think about how to develop that capacity. And that has been an issue for global health analysts for a very long time. And I think it's even more important now that we're seeing some evidence of so-called vaccine nationalism. And I think that is a real concern. I mean, COVAX is great, but I think as Dr. Yamey has pointed out, it's not gotten the number of doses it needs. And there is a fair amount of vaccine nationalism. So I think it would be prudent on the part of the global health community to think very carefully about how to develop more indigenous innovation capacity. And that might require, I mean, I suspect it in some cases, it'll require developing it from the ground up and not even waiting for a tech transfer from companies that are very, very, shall we say, cautious about letting go of any of their intellectual property.
Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And somewhat related to that, and Dr. Denny, Dr. Yamey, I don't know if you could speak to this. We, at the moment, obviously, we have 3 particularly promising vaccine candidates, and it looks like, the doses are being sold in advance, and so they're going to be spread across the world. Is there a chance that, despite the promising results, we could find that one or more of the vaccines is a lot more effective than one of the others, and so countries that have opted for one particular vaccine may find that they end up having less protection than another country that went for a different candidate? Or is it the case that, based on the promising results, they all appear to be so effective that it wouldn't make a significant difference? Can we estimate how that might unfold?
Maybe. David, I might want to throw that back to you, because it's in here in COVAX and all of that. You want to say on that, really?
I'm not sure if your response was garbled for everybody else. I had a bit of trouble hearing you. I think might be a problem with your audio. I'm not sure what's, yeah, no, it's still coming. It's still coming across really, really garbled. So I'm not sure exactly what happened there. But while we try and figure that out, Dr. Denny, do you have any perspective on how the difference between vaccines could play out across countries?
I think short term they're going to be equivalent. I think what we know is they're both 95%, efficacy starting out. I think what will drive this is when we get into this 6 months, 9 months, a year out. If we start to learn that, if for some reason a number of vaccinees in one particular product get infected and have more serious, courses of the disease, then that may start to switch or make it trend a little bit differently. But I think in the beginning they're both starting out about equivalency is what I would frame it. And I'm not sure if Gavin is agreeing with me or disagreeing with me, but maybe give me a thumbs up. Okay, so there you go.
Can you hear me now?
My friend, you're in a submarine.
Yeah, it's now with added echo, so I'm not sure exactly what's happening. Okay, I've muted myself. Okay, we're gonna move on briefly here, and this would be a question for Gavin if it can work, but if not, maybe Dr. Denny, you could tackle this one. Somebody has asked about the UK giving the green light to the Pfizer vaccine faster than the US. Obviously, every country has their own kind of regulatory approach, but this particular question was asking why that was. Is it simply a matter that they moved more quickly, or are there other factors there?
Can you hear me now? No.
Still having the same issue.
You may want to log out and come back in again. Maybe that's, I hate to say that to you, but.
So I can jump in just for a minute, unless Dr. Denny, you want to.
The only part I would say, and I think you probably, is that my understanding in the process is that FDA digs a lot deeper in looking at all the records that are coming in to look at source documentation, where the UK system is a bit more. They take what is given to them and don't necessarily go back to a lot of source documents in the laboratories or part of the clinical trial books. That's my understanding. That is one of the, if you would say, the bureaucratic parts of it. But I'll defer to Gavin or you in more detail.
Can you hear me now? Oh, wow.
Well, Professor Rye, what was the point you were about to make? And then we'll come back to Gavin on
this
that.
Is just a point related to the way that this all worked out. Recall that when it was politicized prior to the election, the FDA took a bold step and put out guidance regarding how it would implement EUA. And that guidance, in addition to the fact it's generally a little bit, I think, more cautious than the UK, that guidance specifically said that it would require clear and compelling evidence of safety and efficacy, And so it was a clear response, I think, to the politicization, and that may have some consequences downstream. I don't think it'll have much. I think we'll soon be ready to approve under EUA, but it was a bold and I think very necessary move on the part of the FDA to push back against the White House.
And before Gavin jumps in, just in case anybody missed the context, the EUA is the Emergency Youth Use Authorization that the government is expected to grant to the vaccines to get them into manufacturing more quickly. Dr. Yamey, please go ahead.
If you can hear me.
Yep.
Just very quickly, I mean, not much to add to that, just that Dr. Denny is right. I would say the UK regulators, MHRA, are excellent. I trust them. My family, I have a physical therapist sister who works on a COVID ward at London's main coronavirus unit. She'll be getting it soon, perhaps as early as next week. So, I don't think they cut corners, but their process is different. They've used rolling data all the way through the year. That's a difference. And they are more, I would say they work more with company data and don't do the kinds of absolutely unbelievable checks and balances the FDA do, which is really the gold standard for the world. Reanalyzing data it is really astonishing. So I think that's part of it as well. There was some mumbo jumbo, total nonsense about how Brexit allowed Britain to move faster. That's rubbish. That's just a lie. They had the authority to move this quickly under EU rules. So Brexit was nothing to do with it at all. So that's the story.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you. And we've just about reached time here, and we seem to have gotten through all the questions at the Q&A. So I think we will call it there. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and for rolling with the punches. Dr. Yamey, well done for figuring out your Darth Vader voice issue. Thanks to our panelists, Arti Raya, Thomas Denny, David McAdams, and Gavin Yamey for sharing your perspectives. If you'd like to be notified of upcoming briefings, please email dukenews@duke.edu. We will be back next Thursday, the 10th at 11 a.m. when we'll be talking about public health messaging and vaccine resistance and how to break through that particular noise. So please join us for that. In the meantime, please stay well, stay home, and wear a mask. Thank you and have a great